So yeah, I think we have mic runner going around, so feel free to raise your hand.
Hi. Thanks for the presentation. I have a question. Pop is going open source. What about the
Asynchronous stuff?
Node stuff?
Not yet. It's a difficult framework to get the API perfect. And so we've been playing around with this idea for a long time. I actually first designed it about 2 years ago when we were working on the very earliest prototypes of Paper. And it was the first kind of major technology we built for this app. But there's been a lot of evolutions of kind of the right way to structure that API. And so we want to make absolutely certain that before releasing something like that future versions of it would be API compatible, and they'd basically be extensions of the API. But I'm happy to talk to you in detail about implementation details.
Hi, thanks again. I really liked the talk about the tutorial, and all the talk about pop made me wonder if there's been any thought about integrating the intrinsic movableness of those UI elements into the tutorial itself, so they might flap to sort of tell you that they want to be pulled or pushed or swung around. Have you guys talked about how those two things could really play together?
So do you mean like adding having hints about how to interact with photos or how to play with them?
Exactly. So like if something's something that you could flap open, it might sort of flap open by itself, just a hint that you should pull it, since it's already so movable and flexible already, just because of pop.
Well, we also kind of want to have a little bit of surprise within the app as well. So like we're moving forward with Paper, we have updates, we'll be launching new features, so there'll be more about that. But it's always fun to figure things out and not have it be told as well. So sometimes the surprise of the interaction is one of the more fun parts.
I think that's an interesting idea. What we tend to do is tell you about the smoothest or simplest way to interact with something. And for example, you can swipe up a photo to open it. It's probably what you'll do most of the time, but we think it's definitely very important to make sure that if a user is simply trying to make your app screw up, that it actually really work correctly. And so things like the pinch gesture, which is a little less commonly used. One reason you might use it is to actually zoom in on a detail of a photo, which is pretty useful when you want to do that. But we don't necessarily want to tell users about that up front because it would make the tutorial much longer in total. But I like the idea of sort of popping up a link booklet cover and stuff like that.
Makes sense. Thanks.
Thanks for all the content. This is all really great stuff, and I'm really excited to see Pop once it goes open source. Brief kind of meta question. What's the availability of these videos and the Q&A to the general public?
Yeah, good question. We are recording this, and we'll be publishing it online for everyone. The main plan is actually for the talks. To be honest, we have not even decided if we'll post the Q&A yet, but let me know what you think.
Hi, I had a question about unit testing the UI. I've had a number of problems with using Cedar, and I was wondering what you all used for testing your UI, and what's worked for you and what hasn't worked for you.
So previously to Facebook, I'd used KIF, and I thought that was a pretty cool framework, but I haven't really kept tabs on things like that. Mostly, we do more unit testing, and we don't have that much integration testing at Facebook right now, but there's actually several teams working actively on that. I know we're much further along on integration testing Android, so if you're looking for inspiration, see what the Android world does.
Yeah, about integration testing, by the way, we've radically improved the accessibility support in Paper as of the next release that's coming soon. Accessibility is a fantastic way to implement integration testing, so that's one interesting connection. Also, you can see in Kimon's open sourcing of POP, there are a ton of unit tests included, and I believe KVO controller is also unit tested.
And tweaks as well.
Yeah.
So.
Hi, that was a fantastic presentation. My question is, when will Paper be scaled for iPad?
Great question. We love the iPad. It's a really big canvas, so it's very challenging to design an app that fits in perfectly with the capabilities and the size of an iPad screen. We wouldn't just want to stretch the app, so we don't have certainly a date or a commitment, but we've explored it internally.
Hi, I have two questions. So my first question is, how does the whole workflow look like? Is it more like a product manager driven or designer driven? And for example, the animations, does that come from designers or come from engineers?
Great question. Someone else mentioned origami, Kimon actually, and it's a great thing to look at because honestly, it was one of the most important parts of building paper. We didn't have time to talk about it today, but basically there's this tool called Quartz Composer that Apple built. It was basically a tech demo, but we've tried to make it into a UI design and interactive prototyping tool, and it's been tremendously successful for us. So we like to think of our project as being primarily design-driven, yet what we actually do is much more of a hybrid between what you might call an engineering-driven project and design-driven. We make sure the engineering team is involved in sort of auditing and giving feedback to the design team from the very earliest stages. And that's founded on the fact that most engineers have years of experience building products. And so they have a very well-honed set of intuitions around if something is easy to use, or if text is too small for a certain group of people, or if it's just not going to come out the way the designers want, so we shouldn't even do that, or things like that. And so I think it's extremely important to have that kind of integration between design and engineering.
I have another question. So it's about the layout specs. You guys mentioned the layout specs hand over to the publishers so they can manage their own layouts. So do you provide them with a finite number of templates, or can they have some tools to drag things around and design? And also, how do you guys test the accessibility in the layouts?
Actually, all the layout specs and all the link covers that we've released so far are written in-house by our own designers. Opening that up to be an API is something we would love to explore in the future, but we don't have any certain plans to yet. And as far as accessibility, it's really in the hands of the designer then, because they get to pick how big the font is and how the text will display. And for instance, text on top of images is very difficult to read. So we do have actually tools to define how big a gradient is going to be and how big a background is going to be to put text on top of an image and increase readability.
Yeah, so those designs are again, built in-house, but we coordinate with publishers before, of course, releasing any of those designs. We work with them to get their feedback on the way it looks, but the tools are in-house, and so as you described, we would want to build out basically editing tools before opening it to publishers directly.
Yeah, I have a question about the process that you guys use within your team, the code review process specifically. You guys obviously have a lot of very unique things about how you're implementing, some of the basic frameworks. So what does the code review process look like? Do you just use the standard pull request with multiple reviewers, or is there something more unique?
I'll let everyone take this question, but we do have mandatory code review in the sense that at least one engineer needs to review something, and we also really love when multiple people are reviewing something. There are different sort of expectations we have depending on what stage of a release cycle we're in and stuff like that. But
we all have a really thorough understanding of the basics of, or not even the basics, we have a thorough understanding of each of these sort of roll your own solutions that we're using here. And so we're all qualified reviewers for anything on that level. But more specifically than that, we each kind of own strong components of the app. We have strong ownership of those, and we generally prefer and wait for those owners to review the components before moving forward.
I'd second that. I think having strong ownership has definitely been important within the development of paper. But in general, I think we also loop just about everybody on the team on every diff, just to help get context. And you never know, they might know something that the person that you think is the best, most qualified person, might actually miss. So.
Yeah, and it's also like how much diff review you want I try to like communicate that, and like we all kind of do, like whether it's like, okay, this is just a generated change, like I just need someone to check it off, versus this is going to be a good changing of the API, like I'm not the expert in this part of the app, can I get a little more thorough feedback, like I want like a deeper review, so you can kind of signal that.
And in addition to our code review process, we have a very structured release process, a hand-over-hand branching system, where that we get to stabilize the release before we ship it, and that's proved incredibly important.
Great, thanks.
Cool. Your custom node view hierarchy was fascinating. I guess the question I had was about how well it integrates with UIKit. And so it sounds like you didn't want to really rewrite UIKit because there's all these great things in it, which makes sense. But if you're flattening all the views to textures, or even they're just backing up layers that back the views, like how can you actually use Apple's views with that? Like, wouldn't you have to render them?
That's a good question. So we basically are primarily interested in using the non-trivial bits like UI gesture recognizer or UI web view. I mentioned some up there. And something like UI label and UI image view, we do not use. And so for one of those pre-compositing things to work, you actually can't use some arbitrary view and expect that to work correctly. So in those subtrees, we don't use like a web view or a map view or something like that. Fortunately, in most of those cases, like MapKit, for example, has a great asynchronous snapshotting system that we use that allows us to avoid that, basically. And the other classes are very easy to rebuild. As I mentioned, Cortex is thread safe, so you can imagine implementing your own label class is not too big a task.
Wouldn't you still have to like render an Apple view, or like say use the snapshotting API? Like, wouldn't you pull it, like you would end up with an image in the CPU, and then you'd have to buffer that back to the GPU, and the round trip wouldn't be worth it? Like you would lose a frame already?
You mean in the case of trying to make the Apple view?
So use like a UI text view.
Sure, and we do use text view. So mainly it's the pre-compositing stuff that wouldn't work very well with that, but you can absolutely mix and match these things in a very similar way to having a view hierarchy that has like some layers sprinkled in. It's even possible to have a layer that has a sublayer which has a view, which you wouldn't really want to do because it will break event handling. The same principles apply to our setup. So you can actually have a layer that has a subnode, for example. We don't recommend doing that. We don't do that internally, but it does actually show up. A few things will break, just like in the view and layer mixing case. But if you start in the other direction and you have nodes at the top and they sort of degrade to views or layers as you go down the tree, that's completely valid. And in the case of a text view or something like that, that works. More specifically, in paper, we switch to nodes when we get to the level of stories. So we actually have like a UI view controller at the top level, and the node hierarchy begins at stories.
Perfect, thank you.
Hi, thank you for open sourcing these components. I'm very excited to try to use them. The next question, are you going to use them as they open source inside your own product, or is this just a fork for open source and you're going to go with your own internal development?
No, we're not planning on forking them. We're not just like throwing a tar ball over the fence. We plan on being active contributors with the community. So yeah.
Yeah, for sure. As I mentioned with the asynchronous stuff, that's one of the reasons we've kind of taken pause with it. Is I think this applies to all Facebook open source initiatives. We want to make sure it's the main branch, basically.
Hi. How much is the content of the tutorials driven by user testing in terms of discovering what people need help with? And I guess more generally, do you do user testing in earlier prototype phases?
Yeah, sure. So we did user studies on both like main Facebook app and paper. One of the big contributors for what we should have hints for was our own internal betas. We also had, before launching, we had a beta that we did with like non-employees who are like close family and friends of Facebook employees. And so we got feedback from them about what were the most difficult parts of the app that were also most important to using the app. And we added hints for those. So we tried to like not overload people with hints, but we wanted to show the important things to make sure people had a full experience.
Yeah, I think on that note, we basically built out the first set of tutorials based on intuition and effectively the design team's sense of what would be most useful for the tutorials, and then benchmarked from that to what surprises we found in testing. And there are definitely surprises. In fact, after we've launched, we've learned some things that we'd like to change about the tutorial. So it's mostly internal beta testing, which is basically employees. Towards the end of app development, we started doing some user testing, pretty small scale. And since it's very easy to change our new user experience, like all the views that slide down and stuff are obviously abstracted, so we can make those edits pretty late in the release.
And we've been doing more user studies as well after launch to get more feedback from people who've like been using it casually on their own.
Yeah, and just a general note on like the way we do user testing. We don't use user testing to validate sort of our vision for ideas. We use user testing. We use user testing to validate very specific questions that we think are sort of natural fits for things that you can ask users. Like you can observe whether or not they found something, but you can't really ask them questions.
Thanks.
Thank you all for these great presentations. I actually wanted to ask about auto layout. Was it ever a consideration for you, and what were your findings?
Yeah, we would have loved to use auto layout, but unfortunately it falls under the sort of like main thread opaque stuff that UIKit does. And in addition to that, auto layout sort of explodes in compute complexity as you start adding more and more constraints. And so you reach this like tipping point relatively quickly where that thunk is very material, and it becomes an overhead that is in addition to text sizing. So text sizing is really the main part of layout that is always expensive. It's going to be really hard to get rid of completely. But auto layout, if you really use it for everything, will be another one of those. And since you can't even tell auto layout, I want to solve the constraints like now, like go do it over there before I show this view, it ultimately wasn't an option.
I had a question regarding accessibility. You mentioned that you're improving it a lot for the next release, and I was wondering, since the app is already really gesturally driven and accessibility is gesturally driven, how did you map that one to the other?
Yeah, that's a great question. By the way, the first version of Paper, I think it was one of the hardest cuts we had to make to not be accessible from the first release. The architecture we built considered accessibility from the very beginning. I put it on that slide for a very good reason, that we didn't want to rebuild the accessibility system, and we wanted it to be exactly consistent with what users expect. And so that integration is extremely important to us. A lot of the accessibility gestures are actually sufficiently different. There are triple taps used and various sort of orthogonal swipes that don't interfere with our gestures. And so for the most part, I don't think we've actually had a big problem with that. I think there might be a couple places where we had to adjust that, but when you have voiceover turned on, that clearly takes precedent. So if there is a conflicting gesture, we prefer the accessibility action.
Hi, I was just curious what sort of things you're doing to sort of instrument your user experience especially and see how it's performing in the wild. If people are discovering these gestures, if there are things they're trying to do that aren't working, that sort of thing.
Maddie, I think you worked on it.
Yeah, sure. So we have our team is a user researcher who will bring people in. We'll do a mix of like shorter informal studies and observational. So like one example of a type of study that we'll bring someone in and they'll just have them kind of use the app, and then like the researcher will kind of ask them like, oh, why'd you do that? Or like, why didn't you do this? Or like, isn't this hint bothering you? Like, why didn't you click the X to like get rid of it and get some information that way? And so that's one informal. We keep track of app reviews as well. Like for me, like I'll go through and just like kind of see what people are looking at. But also we have like quality QA and our user experience researchers who can also get broader data sets about what people like and what they're complaining about, and kind of aggregate them to identify our top issues. And that's the biggest motivator of like the updates we're working on now and the improvements we're making to the app going forward.
That's one thing we use as well for driving the new user experience development is there are certain gestures in the app where we've had some hypothesis about basically we think people will do this, but we're not really sure. And so we'll add an analytics instrumentation that is basically just a statistical calculation of 10% of people do this and 90% do this. And that gives us some feedback on if people can't discover it or if it's not useful enough. Maybe it's obvious, but nobody's using it, and we should just remove it because it's too complex to justify that or stuff like that.
Okay, we have one last question.
Yeah, in terms of the asynchronous pre-measurement for the content that's coming into the view, what are some of the strategies that Paper implements in case that they aren't measured in time?
Yep, great question. So one of the really interesting things about asynchronous UI is that it frees you to preload stuff. So in a traditional UI table view, you literally cannot preload any cells, or at least it's not useful because there is no opportunity you have that would be sort of like better to block the main thread because you can't predict when the user's touch is going to land. So it's just a failing proposition to try to do that. But if your preparation of a new cell does not block the main thread, you're free to do that as much as you want. And in fact, you can control how much you do that based on how much memory the device has, for example, or how much spare CPU you have, or if another operation is already ongoing, or various other matters of prioritization. So we do that very extensively. And if that still fails, which absolutely can happen if you scroll really fast, you're familiar with this placeholder thing. In fact, it's on our icon that shows up in that case, which is basically like a generic story. And so what we really like to do here is try to make that placeholder state, which is synchronously rendered. In this case, it's basically just views or layers that have a background color set on them. So there's no actual rendering to be done. There's a small amount of compositing work. Those we can block on creating and making sure that something is there. Ideally, it's as close as possible visually to what the content looks like. Cool. So we'll be around for the rest of the time until 9:30. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.